Hey everybody, we're down here at the Women's Club of Bakersfield, aka the Rock Cobbler, and we ran into Leigh Donovan. She's working for SRAM now, so she's over at the SRAM tent, talking tech and everything else. But for those of you who don't know, Leigh Donovan is one of the most celebrated mountain bike downhill racers in history. 9-time U.S. national champion for both dual and downhill, and what year was it?
95.
95 world champion out of Kirzarten, Germany. So she knows well about riding on the dirt, and we thought just to switch things up a little bit, instead of having a gravel person talk to us about gravel riding, for the idea of people having a better understanding of how to grapple with traction, dirt, bumps, rocks, to talk to a seasoned professional,
very seasoned,
about just some simple tips about understanding how to ride gravel better and safer, because we want everybody to be out on the dirt, but we want them to be safe and smiling. So for the sake of it, Leigh, we talked about yesterday just over the SRAM tent a little bit about when we were talking to Ashton, you were just talking some basic things because he seemed to be a little out of sorts when he was talking about coming to his downhill section. So what were maybe 3 or 4 key tips you would think about for a person who's coming to gravel, or a road rider coming to gravel, to think about for riding in the dirt?
Well, I think with road cycling, I'm going to start with road because that's on one side, and mountain biking is on the other, and I feel like kind of gravel is in the middle. I think from the road side, a lot of riders, we have a lot of similarities on the mountain bike side too. Some of the things that we have a little bit different are traction is something with mountain biking that you have to optimize. I think on the road, you kind of just tend to have traction. You're seated a lot when you ride. So it doesn't matter if you have weighted hands or, if you're weighted on your seat. On mountain biking, you have to separate from your bike a lot. So you're doing a lot more standing when you're maybe descending, or even through corners. You might be standing more through corners instead of being seated on on your saddle, like you would on the road. I know I'm seated a lot more on my road bike than I ever am on a mountain bike. But talking with Ashton yesterday, he was struggling with the downhill corners. Right. And something I talk about, I was a mountain bike instructor for the last 8 years, is that you want to ride your bike really from the feet first. So in mountain biking, we call heavy feet, light hands. So when you're out on the gravel bike, and let's say you're going through technical sand, or you're going through a downhill that's uncomfortable, or corners, we have a tendency to ride, especially in drop bars, with heavy hands. Yeah. That's for sure. Yeah. And then, with road bikers or with gravel riders, they're riding these teeny little pedals that there's just a little spindle sticking out, and they've got their foot in there, and there's just not really a whole lot of power you can put into those, right?
There's a platform pedal.
So, and on top of that, a clip pedal is really got a stiff sole, so you can't really feel the pedals that much anyways. So it does make it more difficult to stay connected with the feet. So it's easier to ride with your hands. But what I was saying with Ashton is that if you can learn to kind of start to live in the feet when you're in those circumstances, whether it's a corner or it's a downhill that you're feeling a little bit, uncomfortable with, you've now taken the weight off of the front end, and you've been able to put some weight into the back of the bike, which not only gives balance to the bike, but it gives traction. And now it allows you to move the bike more freely underneath you, because you can stand, and that's one of the things with road biking or gravel riding, you have a tendency to want to let the upper body lead you through corners. But on the opposite side of mountain biking, if you did that, we don't really have a round tire, so we just lose it and we slide out. So with the gravel riding, which I think is kind of in between, is that you have to learn how to ride heavy feet, out of the saddle maybe sometimes, but you've got to let the bike do the work underneath you. So you're separating, you're stabilizing, the body stays kind of upright and stable.
You said a pillar.
Like a pillar, your body is the pillar. It's balancing both front and rear, but it's also balancing the bike side to side, right? So it gives you the freedom to do that. And I think that if people can start to learn, especially if you're making the transition from a road bike to gravel, that's something. I think if you just think heavy feet, light hands, you'll start to kind of notice you'll have probably more success, whether it's in sand, whether it's in downhills, even in cornering.
Right. And what about this difference? I mean, you're used to a mountain bike with, these 780 yard bars, I call them.
I don't ride 780. No way. 740 on me, but yeah.
And then, I mean, what do you think? What's your notion about, just in terms of, for people to understand, in terms of, I mean, because that's something, people. I see so many people on dirt bikes. On gravel bikes, when they get in like deep sand, all of a sudden the front end starts wallowing.
Yeah.
And so you obviously have a much narrower stance.
Yeah.
Is there any sense of like, I mean, I don't know, there's the difference between the width of your handlebars?
Well, I'm very inexperienced at the gravel bike,
right.
So I really don't know if I could give you that professional feedback.
Right.
My only understanding really comes more from a flat bar, but even when I would ride a road bike back in the day as a professional, I preferred a little bit wider handlebar.
Yeah.
I liked it. I didn't want it too wide because then that was just super uncomfortable.
Right.
But again, I think that comes back to we're so used to riding heavy hands that also gives us some instability because we're so weighted forward. Mm-hmm. So it really will stop your front wheel if you get in any sand or anything that's a little bit sketchy, pebbly rock. You got to just think it's either going to slide and you're going to be sliding in the front.
Right.
And ideally, I'd rather be more comfortable sliding in the back.
Right.
I want my front to always have traction.
Right.
And so you got to stay a little bit lighter. So if the handlebars should be comfortable, but you shouldn't feel like you have to be so heavy on them. I'm sure that the width of the bar, I'm sure there's something about that would be optimal.
Right.
But like again, I can't give you that feedback.
Right. So one key element definitely that differentiates a mountain bike from most gravel bikes, especially if they're on 700C wheels. Look at the difference in the size tire. This is right.
That's a 2.3. No, 2.4. I think it's a 2.4. Yeah.
And this is like a 38, maybe 40. And so the traction is obviously a big deal difference. And so we're talking about.
I mean, even knobs. Look at the difference, right?
Yeah. So like the one thing we were talking about with Ashton yesterday, and he was talking about he was getting sketchy in the sense, and I was like telling him, I passed on my best Mike Bell, may he rest in peace, advice that Mike Bell gave me from the Kamikaze. He said, because I said, Mike, how do you go fast on the downhill on the Kamikaze? He says, don't use the brakes.
Yeah.
Right? And so for Mike Bell, who was a former motocross champion, supercross champion specifically, he won the Kamikaze, fabulous human being. But it's like that simple, and I was just like, really? That's your best advice? You've broken down this entire thing of this Kamikaze at Mammoth, blah, 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 and he's just, don't use the brakes. So for me, I think that on plenty of gravel rides and races I've done, just you see especially the road bike guys, they come on and they see stuff and they just start like locking up the brakes right away. So my point to Ashton was like, don't live in fear.
Yeah.
And just, you want to flow more. I think that's kind of an important part.
And you know what? It's great advice, but sometimes you can't remove people's fear.
Sure, absolutely.
And so the brakes give people confidence.
Right.
And so I think it's about teaching the technique, and you can do this technique slowly. And so you should, like if you do have a tendency to be a more nervous rider, you should definitely take a skills class or watch some skill videos, learn how to ride with your feet first and have light hands, and try it out on trail that you're familiar with. And I'll take riders out and we'll session sections, and I'll first just go, you ride it, just ride it how you ride it. And then I'll teach them techniques, and then I'll have them ride it again. And it takes them a little bit to apply that technique, but all of a sudden they're like, wow, I do notice a difference. I have 100% control. I mean, pretty much almost 100% control, and I'm not scared.
Right.
And so for me, I always say facts and remove, know the facts and remove the fear.
Yeah.
Because a lot of riders do have fear, and especially like, even for myself, I'm gonna just start getting more into the gravel scene. I'm, ordered a gravel bike and I'm super excited about it. But I do look at these bikes and I'm like, oh, I'm going to have to really rely on my foundational skill base to have success when I first start riding on the bike, and really think about it, not just go ride my bike. At the beginning, I'm going to actually have to practice these skills and be in a parking lot and really start to learn how to separate and ride the bike from my feet, because it is a different position. I'm seated differently on the bike too, right? It's not as upright as as a gravel bike will be. So, but I think what happens with most riders is that they'll just go, oh, it's a bicycle. I can ride that, no problem. I see it with mountain bikers all the time, that transition from road biking, and I'm like, it is a bicycle, absolutely, which is awesome. Let's celebrate that. But there are differences, and if you don't spend the time and effort working on the foundational skills of anything, whether you're a road biker, gravel rider, mountain biker, you're probably going to have a lot of unfortunate learning curves. And I think if you just get into a parking lot and you take your time slowly, you build those skills, Maybe you take a coaching class from someone. I just think your success will be much higher.
Bottom line, last bit of advice for every gravel rider out there, what would be?
I'm new to gravel. I think my one thing would be is learn to master the track stand, and then I think you're going to be a much better gravel rider. Out of the saddle.
Well, yeah, it's interesting you said it, because yesterday, like Dave was telling me on the pre-ride, they were going down this little descent with like rolling, and he says like him and Brian were both out of the saddle, standing up and letting the legs go down, and these other people are all sitting in the saddle, and like, you know, they're doing this, and he's just like, dude, get out of the saddle and, you know.
I tell you what, the track stand, if you get out of the saddle and you learn to master a track stand, it masters you have to separate from the bike, you have to kind of move around, you have to kind of have this balance, and you also are on and off your brakes. I mean, let's say I'm going into a section out on a gravel race. I mean, there could be lots of people out there, and I might have to wait to drop into a section. Well, I don't want to stop. I want to stay clipped in, and I want to kind of be able to, like, I want to be the first one to go when there's an opening. I don't want to have to wait to try to get clipped into my tiny little pedal. So if you're riding tiny little pedals, learn to master that so you don't have to get out of the pedal. But yeah, it's I start every one of my mountain bike clinics with a track stand, and I've been doing that for a couple years now. And I would say that my clients, they get about 30% more out of a class because I start with a track stand. I think that is the skill for all bikers. And I mean, I remember being young and racing mountain bikes, and on the road, that was something we would play around with at every light, right? You know, we're like, who's gonna snap the next person off of the line, right? You know, and I really do think that helps you have the confidence to be still on the bicycle, and that's just another skill in itself.
Right. Well, there it is, folks. I have to say, completely out of left corner. I never thought the track stands would be like the modus operandi for gravel bike success. But you got it from a former national and world champion, Leigh Donovan. We want to thank you for coming to the Ladies Club of Bakersfield. We're going to go in and have some tea and crumpets, and then watch Peter Stettner, I think, finish this race pretty soon in a dominating final. Thanks for coming by, and we'll see you soon.